Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, the middle class revolution, when better off isn't good enough. From Brazil to Turkey, from India to Russia, what's behind the recent protests? A case of missed economic opportunity or leaders overstaying their welcome? Also this week, Mexico's plan to drag millions out of poverty, already the fourth biggest exporter of cars. We tell you why manufacturers are racing to be in Mexico. On the road to energy independence, the US shale revolution that's threatening OPEC's dominance. Could that upend Saudi Arabia's big spending plans? So what's stoking protests around the world? The Arab Spring has been about the removal of dictatorial regimes, mostly due to the lack of economic opportunity. But there's a bigger phenomena at play, it seems, when we look at protests from Brazil to Turkey, India to Russia. And it's something that's being explored right now by social commentators and economists. Could it be the rise of the middle class? Well, we'll test that theory a little later with our guest. But let's put some of this into context right now. Just who are the new middle class? Well, according to the World Bank, in Latin America, they earn more than $10 a day. The Brookings Institute defines the middle class as those who spend $10 to $100 a day. In the largest 20 emerging economies, the middle class has grown by an average 18 percentage points over the last 15 years, now accounting for more than half the population. So, governments have done well to lift people out of poverty, but growth in the BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India and China, has been slowing since 2010. The International Monetary Fund says that developing nations will grow at 5% this year. That's down from its previous forecast and an average growth of almost 7% in the past decade. At the same time, China is slowing. Finance Minister Liu Jiawei saying that the economy there may miss its target growth rate. Well, the trigger for protests haven't been the same. In Brazil, they were triggered initially by bus fare increases, but as protests gained strength, corruption, education and lack of investment in infrastructure became issues. In Russia, what began as protests against alleged voting fraud turned on Vladimir Putin and his United Russia Party, which has been in power for more than a decade. And Turkey's Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan faced unprecedented protests which began over government plans to redevelop an Istanbul park. Now, despite more than a decade in power, many people still back the Prime Minister, as Al Jazeera's Omar Al-Saleh reports now from Istanbul.
This is a man who still enjoys large support despite the recent unprecedented wave of protest against his rule. Supporters of Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan says he's perhaps the most successful leader since Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey. At this dinner in Istanbul, Erdogan called for unity.
No one can compete with what our government has done for this country. Being the majority doesn't mean we ignore the minority.
But the Prime Minister and his government's image have suffered. It all started when a few hundred environmentalists objected to a government plan to build a mall in Gezi Park in the center of Istanbul. But the demonstrators grew to tens of thousands of people protesting against other government policies. Police were accused of using excessive force. 6 people were killed, including a policeman, and thousands of people were wounded. Deniz Ahmed is a university student who says he was protesting against his prime minister.
I just saw my friends are they're just getting beaten by the police officers on the streets, and couldn't keep myself to join it, trying to oppress the people and just seeing them as the voting machines.
Harsh police reaction triggered more criticism of the government. According to recent polls, Prime Minister Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party would still comfortably win in the elections. But the polls also highlight that the number of Erdogan's supporters has declined after the Gezi Park protests. But Ibrahim Adham says the anti-government protest will only increase the popularity of the ruling Justice and Development Party.
During the 60s and 70s, there were coups, and every time the army took over, Erdogan changed all that and ended foreign debt. He works for his country. After Gezi, he will get more votes.
Critics of the Prime Minister says he's becoming authoritarian by cracking down on opponents, the media and personal freedoms. But for Erdogan's supporters, he's leading Turkey to prosperity and success.
All right, let's get some analysis on this now. We have with us Rashi Sha, who's the head of emerging markets at Morgan Stanley Investment Management. He's at the NASDAQ market site in New York. Rashi is the author of Breakout Nations, In Pursuit of the Next Economic Miracle. He manages some $25 billion, mostly in those nations that we've been talking about. So he's got a lot at stake here. Rashi, good to have you with us on Counting the Cost. What do you make then of this middle class phenomena? How would you define it?
Well, the way that I'd say is that it's a bit of a cliche to say that this is all being done, by a new class of wealthy people, or sort of the new middle class, as some people call it. Because if you look at what's happening across the world today, the protests are predominantly taking place in countries where the regimes have been stale or have gotten stale. And I think that this is true of what's happening in Brazil, in Turkey. It happened in Russia last year, in India before that. In all these places, the existing regime, in terms of defined as the ruling party, has been in power for nearly a decade, if not more. And I think that they are not being able to meet the rising expectations of people, particularly at a time when the global economy and their economies as well are slowing down quite sharply. So I think that really is the key point here, that this is a protest against old regimes. And even if you take the case of Egypt, that there's been some churn there as far as the administrations there are concerned, but essentially it's the same battle which is going on from 2011, which is against the existing rulers in some way or the other, is how this battle is being waged, according to me.
And one of the most common complaints against those rulers, as you say, or long-sitting governing parties, is that they've lifted a lot of people into middle class, but that's it. They haven't done enough. They haven't done enough to further prosperity beyond that.
Well, I think that argument can be made at any point in time. That argument could have been made 10 years ago, could have been made 20 years ago. The issue is that why is this all happening all of a sudden now? For example, 10 years ago, why was this not going on? And my point is that there just were not so many stale leaders around. I mean, today what we're seeing in emerging markets is that we have many countries with governments that have been in power for a long period of time. This was not true 5 or 10 years ago. In fact, 10 years ago in emerging markets, we saw a huge churn, which is that a whole bunch of new leaders came to power. They came to power after a pretty tough economic period, and they had fresh ideas, and the people had hope in them. And to some extent, those hopes were fulfilled. And I'm talking about Erdogan in Turkey, Lula in Brazil, and even someone like Putin in Russia when he first came to power. What he was doing seemed to be right for the economy. But what's happened now is that all these leaders now have been in power for a decade or more. And in Lula's case, even though he's gone, Dilma is there, but she's essentially carrying out the same statist policies as Lula. So it's the same party and the same administration. So I think that really is the common factor to me. But to say that this is happening because a bunch of new middle-class people are not being satisfied, or their expectations are not being met, is not a sufficient enough explanation. Because how does that explain the fact that you've got other countries in the world, whether it's a Mexico or the Philippines or even Thailand, where there are no riots taking place or no protests taking place? So the key here is to figure out what is the key factor in terms of differentiating between nations as to why protests are happening in some countries and not in the others.
You say that when people like President Lula da Silva came to power in Brazil, when Recep Tayyip Erdogan became prime minister in Turkey, when Putin took the presidency, they seemed to do something that was right for the economy. But up until the financial crisis, the North Atlantic financial crisis, wasn't it a case that lots of nations around the world saw stellar growth? And to a certain extent, were they just floating on a rising tide, if you like, that it didn't matter what they did, their economies were going to benefit?
Well, there's some element of truth in that. As I've argued in the book as well, that this rising tide of global liquidity lifted all boats, and rising commodity prices in particular played a big role in helping the economies out of Russia, Brazil, which are very commodity-dependent economies. Having said that, if you look back, it's a bit of a chicken-egg story, which is that why did the rising tide lift all boats? It's partly because the boats were fixed. That if you look back in the 1990s, many of these boats were leaking profusely, and I think that was fixed by these leaders to some extent. They cut down their debt levels, they brought inflation under control, so the macroeconomic stability that they approached allowed them to benefit from this big boom that took place last decade. Having said that, there is some element of truth in what you're saying, that the rising tide of global liquidity helped everyone, but I think that their role in the turnaround should not be underestimated. They did play a role in fixing their boats before this rising tide could help lift them.
And did the BRICS squander the advantages brought by that rising tide? I'm thinking particularly of Brazil and the protests that we've seen lately there. Was the opportunity to invest in infrastructure, in education, was that squandered?
Yes, because if you look at Brazil, the amount that they spend on infrastructure is amongst the lowest in the world. They spend just about 2% of their economy on infrastructure, whereas the average for other developing countries is 5%. And China, of course, spends as much as 10% of its economy on infrastructure. And you go to Brazil today, and you know how poor the infrastructure is. I don't know of any airport in the world which is as underdeveloped as the Sao Paulo airport. And I, always have my James Bond moment when I'm landing up in Sao Paulo, which is that you sort of go from one meeting to another, often by a helicopter on the rooftop of these fancy buildings out there, because the roads are so clogged. So I think that is a real problem, and the amount they spend on social spending, or it's got to do with the pension system, is enormous. So Brazil has one of the highest government spending to GDP ratios in the world, at close to 40%, at least in the developing world, and the lowest of the amount is spent on physical infrastructure. So that really puts many people at odds with what's happening in the rest of the world.
All right, let's talk about currencies for just a moment. At the moment, we've got money pouring back into the dollar, so we can assume then that money is moving out of emerging economies back to the West. Would it be fair to say that emerging economies are still sorely dependent upon Western money, and what do the BRIC economies need to do to reverse that?
Yeah, I think there's both a push and a pull factor. So what you have identified is the pull factor, that the U.S. economy seems to be doing better than what people expected, the private economy at least, and that's attracting some capital back here. Even in Japan, we have seen a similar process. That after the Bank of Japan carried out easy monetary policies, in fact, money has come back into Japan rather than left Japan. So I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. But there's also a push factor, which is that the fundamentals of these economies have arguably deteriorated. In India's case, it's a complete mess in terms of what's going on out there. Their economic growth has collapsed because they've carried out no economic reforms in any meaningful way for the past decade. The entire focus has been on welfare spending and on increasing social spending. In Brazil, as you just pointed out, the case has been very similar. So I think that what these countries have done is that they have not focused enough on carrying out any productivity enhancing reforms. They've allowed the state to get too big. The companies, particularly the state-oriented companies, to get very unprofitable. And so therefore investors are getting disillusioned with the returns that they've been getting in these markets at a time when the US economy in particular is showing signs of some life. So it's both a push and a pull factor. So what these economies need to do is to really get back to the reform path.
Rashi, I really enjoyed the book. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for being with us on Counting the Cost.
I enjoyed that. Thank you.
And as Rashi mentioned there, Mexico has a rising middle class but hasn't seen protests. The middle class accounts for almost 40% of the population, or 44 million people. Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto is hoping that the auto industry can be one of the engines of growth in his country, sucking even more people out of poverty. Adam Rainey has our report from Mexico City.
This is the largest car factory in the Western Hemisphere. Volkswagen's plant in the central Mexican city of Puebla produces about 2,500 cars a day. Mexico has become the world's fourth largest auto exporter, and last year the country broke its own record and produced 3 million vehicles. Most go to the United States, but Mexico now sends cars all over the world.
Mexico has a competitive advantage. Because of free trade agreements with many countries, Mexico can export cars all over the world without paying export taxes. This is true for North America because of NAFTA. It's the same for many South American countries, Europe, and even Japan. No other country in the world has this advantage.
According to Mexico's central bank, revenue from car exports now tops more than $32 billion and has passed remittances as Mexico's #1 source of foreign currency. For workers like Carmen Huerta, a job at VW's plant has secured them a place in Mexico's middle class. She works the day shift and her husband works nights. They cross paths to have dinner with the kids. Together they earn about $30,000 a year, enough for a comfortable life here.
When jobs are posted, there are lines and lines of people from here in Puebla and the surrounding states, because they see the benefits we have and how happy we are. So yes, a lot of people want to get a job at Volkswagen.
But some industry watchers say the foreign auto companies are getting a better deal than workers like Carmen.
Without a doubt, they're getting a better deal. That's why they're here. And that woman that you interview, when she sees herself compared to others, she's doing quite well. A worker of her aptitude in Germany or in the United States would make 3 times more. And as the pool of labor gets hired in Mexico, her standard of living should go up.
Audi is planning to build SUVs in Puebla, and a new Nissan plant is underway in central Mexico. Mexico, meanwhile, is hoping the new jobs will allow thousands more to enter the middle class. But with nearly 60 million people still in poverty, the road to a wealthy Mexico could be a long one. Adam Rainey, Al Jazeera, Mexico City.
Now, it's a topic that we've discussed before, but one with a new twist. America's shale gas revolution is shattering the old world order. Some OPEC members have seen demand for their crude decline, and that's raised concerns that OPEC nations aren't moving fast enough to diversify their economies. Well, that's certainly the thinking of Saudi billionaire investor Prince Al-Waleed bin Talal. In an open letter addressed to Saudi Arabia's oil minister, he warned that his country's oil-dependent economy is increasingly vulnerable to competition from the US shale revolution. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest crude oil producer, earning $336 billion from petroleum exports last year, accounting for 90% of the country's export revenues, according to OPEC. The country has outlined plans to spend $500 billion to reduce its dependence on hydrocarbons. OPEC nations saw a record windfall from petroleum exports last year, almost $1.3 trillion. Well, joining us now from London is Manouche Takin. Now, he's a senior petroleum analyst at the Centre for Global Energy. He also spent 9 years working for OPEC, so he's in a great position to give us his insights. Thanks for being with us, Mr. Takin. Was Prince Al-Waleed right in his assessment that Saudi Arabia is vulnerable to the US shale revolution?
Well, it depends on the definition. I don't think you should use vulnerable, because this is not a critical issue, but it will be affected. Demand for Saudi Arabia and for other producers, especially OPEC as a group, that control their production in order to defend the price. Those outside OPEC, they maximize, they sell as much as they can. So for this group, including especially Saudi Arabia, which is the kingpin within the OPEC group, who control, it will have adverse effect. There is more oil being supplied into the market outside OPEC areas, and therefore the residual demand, residual call on OPEC oil would be less. But this would take some time, and there is a lot of debate of how much and when will be the actual quantitative impact on it. Already in the United States, about 2 million barrels per day production is from shale and tight formations. And 2 million barrels per day has come into production in the last 2, 3, 4 years. The US production has increased by about 2.5 million barrels per day in the last 4 or 5 years. And this is quite opposite the trend which was declining oil production in the US. Everyone would thought it will continue lower and lower. So already the demand on OPEC oil is less by about 2 million, 2.5 million barrels per day, less than what it would have been had there not been this reversal of the US oil production. declining, going up.
You talk about the impact over the long term on the Saudi Arabian economy then, if it's selling less oil on the global market. What about the other OPEC members though, the less wealthy nations, those particularly in Africa?
There on the impact on the economy, we have to think of the scenario of the oil price. Assuming this and that happens, what would be the price of oil in the world? And that is where OPEC policy comes in. If it is an adjustment of a few million barrels per day over the next 5-10 years, it will be some pressure on OPEC and on Saudi Arabia, but between them they can manage. There have been cases in the past when the oil price demand in the world has collapsed, like in 1986, like in 1978-79, that because of economic slowdown in the rest of the world was buying less oil. So OPEC lost quite a bit of the demand for its oil. And this will be, and OPEC managed. And people try to exaggerate these crises. OPEC as a group has been managing. But of course, demand falls, the actual production falls, and even if they try to avoid the price falling, it is at the cost of actually less supply from OPEC. So they will suffer. But I don't think it is going to be as serious as people are thinking to affect the budgetary requirements within OPEC countries, not in the next 3 or 4 years.
All right, I wanted to talk to you about those budgetary issues here. Let's talk about this from a socio-economic, political point of view, if we can. Saudi Arabia, for instance, says that it wants to spend some $500 billion on various infrastructure projects over the next few years, including housing. Is it going to be able to meet those demands? And if it can't, if its income is dropping significantly, what will be the impact, do you think, on Saudi society?
Well, that is really a political or social question. I don't claim to be an expert on it, but obviously it would be difficult. You see, the Saudi budget, if you look at it in the last 10-15 years, the minimum required price for oil in order to meet the following year budget used to be about $70, then $80, $90. Now it is something between $90 and $95 a barrel. That is the current budget, and the next year or so for Saudi Arabia, it does require an oil price of about more than $90, $95 a barrel. And if the price of oil, because of these issues, falls down to, let's say, $60, $70, $80, that will be difficult. But how it will impact, I really can't tell you, because the budget includes some consumable expenditure as well as capital expenditure, as well as paying debt in the just financial requirements, and one has to look at it in that way. But overall, I think all OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia and others, are very much, their economies dependent on revenue from oil, and they are single product commodity exporters to a large extent. Even diversification, when they talk about away from oil, it is petrochemicals and others which are still related to oil. So it would be serious and difficult for the Saudi authorities to manage them.
And where do you see the price of oil over the next few years?
The price of oil, I think most analysts agree that it is under pressure downward. But I think most people say that in the 2013, 14, and 15, it will not fall less than about $80 a barrel. Probably next year will be still about $90 to $100 a barrel, and beyond that about 80 or so. I say this because it will still come back to OPEC as a group, that it is a stated policy of the organization. And as far as the drop in demand or excess production from the competitors is not more than 2, 3, 4 million barrels per day over the next 5-6 years, OPEC as a group can manage by reducing their supply to defend the price. So it is really OPEC policy of what price they'd like to defend. And in the past, people have said $80 or $75, $80 is the minimum. And whatever happens, all OPEC countries will get together and they hammer out a production policy and restrain a supply in order to defend that price. So I think looking at the next few years, a minimum price of 80 is one we can think of.
Mr. Takin, it's been great to talk to you. Thanks for being with us on Counting the Cost. And that's our show for this week. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/business, the latest business headlines, plus all of our previous episodes for you to catch up on. And then to get in touch with us, well, you can tweet me at @afinnegan or you can drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.